Welcome to Holy Week 2020. This isn't what I was expecting to do, and this certainly isn't where I was expecting to do it. But come and join me on the journey that we take through the last events of Jesus' life, and of course onto the great events of Easter Day. Today I want to invite you to come and join me in the garden. It's my garden, of course, but it's also the Garden of Gethsemane, the garden where the story started. Matthew chapter 26. Let's hear the story first. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I'm deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So couldn't you stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for the second time and prayed, "Father, if this can't pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed." Well, this was a tough time for Jesus in the garden. And as I've been looking at this story and thinking about it through the spectrum of what we're all experiencing at the moment, being in our own gardens of Gethsemane, as it were, asking these agonizing questions, full of fearfulness, what's going to happen next? Yet with a sense that in some ways we kind of know what's going to happen next. It's given me a whole set of different spectacles through which to look at this familiar story. I guess we often think of this story as Jesus putting the disciples right. You know, he takes his favourites, the ones who are really, really committed, and they turn out to be the ones who, well, they fall asleep. And he tells them off. But actually, what I want to do is to invite you into this story and to reflect on where we might learn from it in today's rather different circumstances. The first thing is that there's a tremendous sense of vulnerability about Jesus himself, which when you put it in the context of the bigger picture of who Jesus claimed to be, and indeed who Christians have always believed him to be, vulnerability isn't exactly what you would have in mind, is it? And yet here we find Jesus at his most vulnerable, being personally open, the exact opposite of what you imagine the Son of God was supposed to be like. The opposite certainly of the macho images that we've inherited, in which certainly proper men, if not real women of the world, are supposed to have no feelings, no emotions, never to be fearful about things. We're learning a great deal about fear in these days. Well, I don't know about you, but I certainly am. And I'm learning a lot about myself. I think there's an invitation here for us all to be like Jesus and recognize that there are some things that we can't easily cope with alone. We actually need the community of faith. We need friends around us to be able to be the people who we long to be. Many people are discovering that their friends and their communities are not who they thought they were, as we work out new ways of serving one another, encouraging one another, being there for one another in a time and space where we can't physically have any connections with each other. The one thing we all suffer from long before this happened to us was fragmentation in our many communities, in the home as well as in the wider culture. And many of us are struggling with the fragmentation because we're now discovering having to work in the same space as even those people we thought we once knew, that it's harder to do than we imagined it would. And so many people are finding themselves, this is a time of real trial. Is this our Garden of Gethsemane? We're certainly vulnerable. I mean, some bits of the population have been specified by governments as particularly vulnerable. Healthcare workers, those of a certain age, people with certain illnesses and pre-existing conditions. It's a fearful time for us all. But then there's also a lesson here in patience, I think. I've been thinking about this a lot. The disciples fell asleep. Well, it's the exact opposite for a lot of people I'm talking to today. It's not that they're falling asleep, they can't get to sleep, and they're becoming sleepless, whether in the middle of the night or the early hours in the morning. So it's not going to be good news to be told, what's wrong with you that you can't stay awake? Because actually many of us would love to be able to get to sleep in the first place. I wonder what Jesus is actually encouraging them to be. He wasn't rebuking them for being human, for falling asleep. After all, remember that as far as we can see from the various stories, they'd been up out of bed for at least 24 hours, or there's no evidence anyway, no mention of them taking a night off, going back to their homes, or indeed anywhere else for a good night's sleep. And after all the excitement of Palm Sunday, they had a little breathing space, and then of course they fell asleep. I wonder what Jesus' encouragement to them to stay awake might mean for us. I wonder if it's about intentionality. And Jesus was saying, look, you've got this enforced period when you're with me. Before the end comes, in his case, before the crucifixion, use that space with intentionality. Don't just let it drift away from you, but reflect on how you can best use the space that you've now got. It's a short space in the case of this particular story, and of course we might have much longer spaces, longer times to be playing with in the next weeks and months. One of the things I've discovered about myself is that it's really easy to actually do nothing. Not necessarily enjoy doing nothing, but just to end up doing nothing, because there's, well, nothing to do. Actually, there's loads I can do, and I have done loads. I need to be fair with myself as well. But what would it look like for us to use this time in an intentional kind of way? I think one of the clues is in this story, because the answer to what Jesus was going through, what he was facing, that vulnerability, the answer was prayer. Well, I say the answer. It was the answer in the sense to the question, what is a good way to spend this time? It wasn't the answer to every conceivable question, like, why is this happening? Why does it have to be this way? And I suspect that at this time one of the things we're being called to is a rediscovery of some very traditional Christian disciplines of spirituality, of reflection, of meditation, and of prayer. So vulnerability, yes, we're all fearful in many different ways. Patience, that's a much bigger challenge. And I want to invite you to join me in exploring what prayer might look like in this context, to do it well beyond Holy Week, for it looks like we're going to have this for a long time ahead. And I want to finish this today with a prayer that has been written by members of the Mission Theology Advisory Group, whose resources you can find at spiritualjourneys.org.uk. This is a prayer for God's blessing in a time of coronavirus. Loving God, bless and receive all who are affected by coronavirus, especially those who are sick and afraid, those who are especially vulnerable, those for whom home is not safe or available, those who've lost their livelihoods, those who've lost their lives, those mourning for loved ones. Bless all those who are caring for the sick. Give them strength, wisdom, endurance. Grant them healing hands. Surround them with your love. Spare us in the time of trial. Deliver us from evil. Amen.